Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Guide, a podcast exploring the history and heritage of England's towns and cities. On this podcast, we uncover how history has shaped the places we live in today, and how, quite often, centuries of past decisions still influence modern urban life and culture. Few cities illustrate this better than Oxford, which we're returning to today. In our last episode, we explored Oxford's political history, a topic so rich and complex it filled an entire episode on its own. Today, we're moving on to our next two themes. First, science and industry. Unsurprisingly, the University of Oxford will play a central role here. But beyond the university, there has also been a major industrial development, entirely separate from academia, developments that have profoundly shaped the city we see today. Secondly, we'll be looking at arts and culture. Once again, the influence of the university looms large, with generations of students and scholars shaping Oxford's cultural identity and global reputation. Parts 1 and 2, the last two episodes you can find on our website. They introduce the university itself and the political influence on the city. And if you haven't heard those episodes yet, it's well worth going back to those. They can be found on our website, yeoldeguide.com, and on all major podcast platforms. I'm Liam McGrath, and I'm delighted to introduce Daniel Gooch, our resident historian. So, Daniel, let's get straight back into it. Let's get into our next category, science and industry. Perhaps we can start with the university, its scientific influence, and perhaps compare Oxford with Cambridge, which we've covered on a previous episode. It's a city that's similar in many ways, but one that's taken a slightly different scientific and industrial path.
Yes, that's right. When we did Cambridge, as I recall, we gave colossal points for science and perhaps a little less for industry. There's really a comparison here because I think it could perhaps go the other way. Oxford has definitely been an industrial city, far more than Cambridge. But for the university, historically, science was less of an area of focus of study and research than it was for Cambridge, certainly before the Second World War, which is perhaps a clue that it focused more on arts. And we'll see some of that great literary and cultural heritage in the arts and culture category later on. But nevertheless, in science and industry, there are still some great figures and achievements to speak about with Oxford.
Yes, I think that's exactly what we'll see. So what we'll do, Daniel, is we'll go more or less chronologically for science, and there's a lot going on. So Oxford University, as you say, specialised in certain areas of science, perhaps chemistry, biosciences, geology, more than Cambridge, which is obviously renowned for its physics, and arguably, as you say, Cambridge led up until recently. Oxford's influence on science stretches remarkably far into the past, though, as far back as the 13th century. Figures such as Robert Grosseteste and shortly afterwards Roger Bacon were already developing ideas around observation, experimentation, and systematic methods for understanding the natural world. And if we zoom forward a few hundred years from there to the 17th century, this brings us to Oxford's real age, golden age of science, when experimentation, instruments, measurement, and collaboration became central to scientific work. At this point, a remarkable group of polymaths were working in and around Oxford, helping to lay the foundations of modern science. Who were these scientists and why were they so important?
Yes, I think you're right. It's been argued, the resurgence of science in England in the 17th century did start to a great extent in Oxford, and because of some of the work that was being done there by some of the great figures of scientific history. The Royal Society, to give it some structure, was formed in 1662, may have been formalised in London, but came about from earlier meetings in Oxford at Wadham College. And two of the Society's most famous early members, Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke, were Oxford scientists. Among other things, Boyle came up with Boyle's law regarding the relationship between the pressure and volume of a confined gas, first defined the chemical element, and first distinguished compounds and mixtures, while Hooke discovered the biological cell, developed many important scientific instruments, and became the City of London surveyor after the Great Fire. So yes, polymaths, definitely. Around the same time, Edmund Halley too studied at Oxford in the 1670s, returning as a professor later and publishing many works while there. Edmund Halley Road in Oxford Science Park is named after him.
And all of this scientific thinking, it seemed to centre on Wadham College under the stewardship of John Wilkins, who was its warden. And what's so remarkable about this group for me is the breadth of their achievements, right? So I said polymath because Robert Boyle, for example, and Robert Hooke, who developed the air pump, as you say, but he also went on to write works in chemistry. He did lots of different things in a way that I suppose scientists did at the time. Another member of this circle was Christopher Wren, who most people think of as St Paul's Cathedral and rebuilding London churches after the Great Fire. But he was Professor of Astronomy in Oxford at this time. John Locke, I believe, was also at Oxford at this time. You think of him as a philosopher, but he was a scientist initially. So this extraordinary burst of scientific achievement happened at this time, 17th century Oxford. And it's fair to say that it was the centre of science in Britain at the time. But later, 18th century and beyond, Oxford went into a bit of a lull. The mantle, I suppose, of scientific achievement moved to Cambridge with figures like Isaac Newton, perhaps even the Midlands. We've discussed in our Stoke episode the Lunar Society, and later to Scotland and the industrial north of England. But then in the 19th century, Oxford came back to prominence in a very visible way. We'll talk about the Oxford Museum of Natural History in a few moments. That opened in 1860. And in the same year that opened, in that location, a really important and profound debate took place in Oxford.
Yes, the Oxford evolution debate, the Huxley-Wilberforce debate, or Great Debate as it's also known, of 1860. It happened, as you said, in the university's Natural History Museum, which you can, of course, visit today, and is considered, perhaps to an extent retrospectively, as a seminal moment in the development of natural selection as a mainstream and accepted scientific theory. It was attended by a very large crowd. It happened mere months after Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species had been published. Now, while they weren't the only protagonists, it's mostly known for the ideological clash between Bishop Samuel Wilberforce and the scientist Thomas Huxley, nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog. Bishop Wilberforce had been both preaching and writing vehemently against Darwin's ideas, while Huxley had been forcefully championing them.
And who won this debate?
Well, it's generally thought of as having been a win for Huxley. No one accurately recorded what was said, but the most famous reported exchange is Wilberforce taunting Huxley over whether he was descended from an ape through his mother or father, with Huxley replying that he'd rather be descended from an ape than an intelligent man who refuses to engage properly with scientific discussion. He probably put it more pithily and wittily than that. The legacy of the debates is perhaps a bit more contested. It's seen as a really important moment in the acceptance of evolutionary theory, as I said, though some suggest it may not have been made that much of a splash at the time, was maybe resurrected a bit in later years to add to Darwinian and scientific mythology. Nonetheless, it's a great moment in the early history of Oxford Natural History Museum, and it's commemorated there in the Huxley Room, where the debate was held, and a pillar erected outside in 2010 to mark the 150th anniversary of the debate.
Yeah, it's well worth visiting the museum. So from the 19th century onwards, Oxford, one important figure in geology is William Buckland, who studied at Corpus Christi College, Oxford. Buckland was an associate of Charles Darwin, and among his many contributions, he made striking geological and paleontological discoveries. He showed that a cave in the north of England that had once been occupied by hyenas are not animals washed up from Noah's flood. So this is the kind of thing that happened in Oxford, right? Those big debates between sort of ancient religious or old religious ideas and modern science. And I think that's one of the great things about Oxford and its museums. You sort of really feel this and it brings it to life. Now, as we mentioned before, in some respects, Oxford's scientific reputation appeared to lag behind Cambridge as the 20th century approached. When we spoke about Cambridge, we spoke about the Cavendish laboratory where so many breakthroughs in modern physics took place. But that isn't the whole story, because in the 20th century, Oxford saw some groundbreaking achievements, particularly in medicine. So shall we explore some of those major achievements of the 20th century?
Yeah, certainly. There was, as you said, definitely kind of a shift from pure arts to more of a scientific focus, or putting it in more of an equal footing in the second half of the 20th century. One source writes that the amount of space at the university dedicated to science doubled in the 1950s and 60s, and that by 1961, 31% of undergraduates were studying science or technology subjects, so a pretty good proportion by that point. Oxford produced 6 scientific Nobel laureates between 1945 and 1973. And we can pick out some of the achievements. One I really want to focus on, because it's so important, is the development of penicillin as a medicine. Now, penicillin was one of the first antibiotics used and is still one of the most popular. It's saved millions of lives since its discovery. Estimates range wildly between 80 million and 500 million, but it's still staggering numbers you can't even comprehend of people whose lives have been extended. One study suggests antibiotics in general, of which penicillin, of course, was a pioneering discovery, have extended the average human lifespan by 23 years.
That's incredible. That is
Yes.
absolutely incredible.
It is
Wow.
amazing. I don't know how you calculate that, but we are talking about one of the greatest breakthroughs in medical history. And
Yeah.
I should pinpoint exactly what the Oxford connection is here, because people might be screaming, well, Alexander Fleming, of course, first found penicillin, and he found it in a lump of mold at a hospital in London. But the Oxford connection is that it was isolated and purified and turned into a usable medicine at Oxford. The 2 Oxford scientists who achieved this shared the Nobel Prize for Medicine with Fleming, and the Florey building in Oxford is named after one of them, Howard Florey. And the Oxford connection doesn't end there. It goes beyond the university, because penicillin was first used for active treatment on an experimental basis in 1941 on a dying policeman from Oxford who'd got an infection following a cut on his face. He did start to recover, so there was some efficacy from the penicillin. Unfortunately, couldn't make enough at this point to keep him alive, and he died after a month. But still, you've got one of the most important breakthroughs in medical history being honed and applied for the first time in Oxford.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's also worth highlighting, I mean, in this era as well, and related to that, is Dorothy Hodgkin, one of those Nobel Prize winners. She developed X-ray crystallography, and I can't pretend to know the details of what that is, but it did win her the Nobel Prize for Science. And I think this is a method of revealing the atomic structures of penicillin, vitamin B12 and insulin, and they've had lasting medical impact. An interesting connection with her is she was also a teacher, and among those who she tutored was a young chemist known as Margaret Roberts, who you might know better as Prime Minister of Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. What a connection. Today, Oxford's biomedical presence continues to expand rapidly. You see this in the south and west of the city, like around near the football ground. You'll see lots of buildings being constructed, and there's all sorts of important places there. The Dunn School of Pathology, Wellcome Centre of Human Genetics, Jenner Institute. All of these important places in science today. And I suspect when we've spoken across the centuries there about science, we've missed loads of scientists. I think that's almost inevitable across medicine, biology, mathematics and computing. The list is endless. I think I said in the first episode, there's something like 2,000 Wikipedia articles on people that studied at Oxford. So there's just so many. But what strikes me most, though, is the unbroken thread of discovery running through the scientific story of Oxford and how that's celebrated in the museums. It strikes me, though, that there's this unbroken thread of discovery running through Oxford's scientific story, from those early breakthroughs in the philosophy of experimentation, through the development of precise instruments and measurement, and right up to modern achievements such as the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which saved so many lives during the COVID pandemic. But it's the final step, industrialisation, that becomes crucial to the economic and physical development of the city itself. I think this is now a good time to come on to industry. We've already touched on some of the modern industries that grew out of Oxford's academic achievements. Now let's step back and talk more broadly about industry in Oxford. Let's start with historical industries, Daniel.
If you're going back into the deep past, there isn't a huge amount to say here, I should probably say. For a long time, Oxford wasn't really an industrial city. Most of what was there serviced the university. In the Middle Ages, you had some manufacturing like cloth and leather, typical things you might see in a large town at that time. But again, the main commercial businesses were really there to serve the university and the students rather than any broader hinterland.
But Oxford was a sizable city, I suppose, at the time. So you'd have expected more industry. Why did that not happen?
So, yeah, I suppose in the early days of industrialised Britain after the Industrial Revolution, industrialisation did sweep the country in the 18th century. Not Oxford so much, though. Now, that isn't just because of its location. I know we have this view of industrialisation as a northern phenomenon in many circumstances, but there were certainly numerous other southeastern towns and cities that definitely did become hubs of industry and manufacturing, as we saw, for example, in our Reading episode, Reading being really not far at all from Oxford. But early industrialisation did incidentally benefit Oxford through general improvements to logistics and communications. You had regional and national investment in communications, bringing better postal and transport links, plus the first local newspapers. But Oxford probably continued to be maybe a bit anachronistic from a commercial perspective into the 19th century even. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Heavy industry doesn't necessarily make you a better place. There's nothing qualitative about it, objectively speaking. And many people liked Oxford as it was. One visitor summed it up this way: "Let him then who is fond of indulging in dreamlike existence go to Oxford and stay there." But still, the university city seemed to be in its own little world. One diarist complained that if you asked anyone there a question, they just show you Latin and Greek books as if they gave you the instant answer, as it never occurred to them there were people who didn't speak either language. So this kind of commercially industrial anachronistic character, it really features in literature too. In the 1890s, Oxford features in Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure. It kind of sums up the antiquated injustices of the class system. It's presented as this idealised place of academic hope and aspiration that's ultimately unobtainable to anyone of Jude's low social class. But this anachronism, if you want to call it that, was turned to Oxford's commercial advantage, particularly when it started to attract lots of tourists, particularly American tourists in the mid-19th century, who didn't have the same kind of old stuff, you can put it that way, to look at in their own country. Herman Melville, writer of Moby Dick in 1857, described Oxford as lands for centuries, never molested by labour. The picturesque never goes beyond this. However, one knock-on effect was there could be lots of unemployment in Victorian Oxford, particularly because this was a city still, in many respects, built to or designed to serve the university and its students and its staff. So when you got to the periods where these students and staff who provided this employment and trade in term time disappeared during the holidays, you would get a lack of work there.
Yeah, I just wonder if because it was this tourist centre and it was proud of its buildings and urban layout, perhaps that created some resistance to industrial development. I know there was some resistance to the railway there, although that happened in many cities, to be fair. So let's talk about industries that did make it, starting off with marmalade, of all things.
We definitely should, because we did say at the beginning that Oxford was an industrial city, but it's more of a kind of a late start, I think it's probably fair to say. But the first major industry they got was in 1900 with the marmalade factory. Now, Frank Cooper's may be a familiar name to people because you can still buy Frank Cooper's Oxford marmalade very, very widely, particularly in this country. It was enjoyed by James Bond and royalty. The brand was really set up in the 19th century, a bit earlier, when Frank Cooper began selling his wife Sarah Jane's marmalade from his shop in the High Street in 1874. So maybe we should really call it Sarah Jane Cooper's Oxford marmalade. It was still made on the High Street until a factory was built in 1903. Now, although production moved from Oxford in 1967, the old jam factory is still there, very close to the station. Search for it on Google Maps if you want to find it. It's right there, and you can very easily see it when you come off the train.
Yeah. Now, I have to say, I didn't know about the marmalade production myself, but certainly an industry that I have heard of associated with Oxford is publishing, which is absolutely huge in this city.
Yes, Oxford has really been formative and produced some of the most famous individuals and institutions in British publishing. If you look at recent figures in publishing, Rupert Murdoch went to Worcester College, managed the student newspaper, Cherwell there. And beyond the university, the notorious publisher and fraudster Robert Maxwell, owner of numerous newspapers, including The Mirror and numerous publishers, lived at a mansion in Headington, the city, in a building that's now part of Oxford Brookes University. He was chairman of the local football club, Oxford United, when they had their greatest moment, winning the 1986 League Cup, but also tried highly controversially and unsuccessfully to merge the club with Reading in 1983 to form a new club, Thames Valley Royals.
Disgraceful.
Robert, to link to contemporary events, is the father of the sex offender and associate of Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, who was raised in Oxford and educated there. But Oxford's importance to publishing goes back much further than these contemporary figures. The Oxford University Press, today the largest university publishing house in the world, was founded in 1586. And by the mid-17th century, Oxford was one of the country's main centres for printing and publishing, though admittedly a long way behind London in most measurements by, for example, numbers of books produced, because London was really the intellectual centre of the country at this time. But publishing in Oxford grew, particularly in the 19th century, partly because of an increased demand for religious texts, and then later demand for textbooks for schools as compulsory schooling was introduced. And following this, the Oxford University Press expanded overseas from around 1900. It published its first Oxford-titled book, which no undergraduate reading this will be without, the Oxford Book of English Verse in 1900.
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive brand, isn't it? I mean, everyone's heard of Oxford University Press, and it's got quite a massive history of its own within Oxford. The other thing, of course, that we've all heard of is the Oxford English Dictionary, which is like the dictionary.
Yes, it's the major authority on the English language. It was first published in stages. It was an astonishing achievement. The first part, A to Ant, which was still huge, came out in 1884 after 27 years of work. And the final volume, V to Z, wasn't published until 1928. So you're looking at I think 70 years of work going into it, just the first volumes there. It had been worked on first by a man called James Murray and then by successive editors, all connected with the university.
Yeah, and I mean, it's massive, isn't it? And every year it's the Oxford English Dictionary that figures out whether a stupid new word invented on social media gets added. And I always enjoy that bit of the year. Now, there's a very famous bookshop in Oxford, which I enjoy visiting, and I'm sure you do as well, and that's Blackwell's, right there in the middle of Oxford, Broad Street.
Yes, one of my favourite places to visit. Blackwell's, a really huge bookshop. I think there is more than one, but there is an original one, which is the biggest one, where most of the books are held. It's where Blackwell's is kind of a brand that you'll find in many university campuses in this country. It's where undergraduate students have been sent with their reading lists for years, but the first one was that giant one in Oxford. It was opened in 1879 by Benjamin Blackwell, originally sold second-hand books. At first, it just occupied number 50 Broad Street, but it later expanded into the buildings next door. If you've never been there, honestly, the selection is colossal in there. It's a massive bookshop spread across several floors, covering just about every topic you can think of. It's great to visit.
Yeah, well worth a visit. And yeah, it's right there on Broad Street with lots of other things that we've mentioned. So easy to see. Now, we've spoken a lot about the industries associated, I suppose, tangentially or completely with the university, in the case of Oxford University Press. Let's talk about Oxford's first mass industry, which initially had little to do with the university. Can you tell us about car manufacturing in Oxford?
Yes, cars. The British Motor Corporation was based in Cowley to the south of the city. The Morris Mini Minor was built there, as were various cars with names inspired by Oxford, such as the Morris Oxford, the Morris Cowley, and the Morris Isis. Now, Morris Motors, if we go back to the beginning of the story, one of the companies that merged to form the British Motor Corporation, was started in Longwall Street in Oxford by William Richard Morris, who was an Oxford man educated in Headington. Before he was 20, he had a shop at 48 High Street repairing bikes. He started repairing bikes and then cars and then building his own car, the Morris Oxford, also known as the Bullnose, from these new buildings in Longwall Street in 1913. In the 1920s, Morris took the brave move of cutting his prices, which led to increased sales and the company becoming the largest car maker in the country by 1926. And as a result of this, the impact on Oxford was huge. Oxford's economy became hugely reliant on car manufacturing. By 1951, one source states that 41% of the city's male workforce was employed in just this one occupational category of manufacturing, which was higher than any other major town or city in the south of England.
Yeah, and what sort of prosperity did this bring to the city?
Well, really quite prosperous, incredibly important to the city's economy. By the 1930s, there was only a 5% unemployment rate by 1934, I think. And Morris himself certainly was generous to the city. He made donations to the hospital in Headington and to the University of Oxford. He established Nuffield College, which, reflecting kind of the source of its benefactors' wealth, was one of the first really properly modern colleges. It was the first where both sexes were housed together, the first modern college to focus on one subject area, social sciences. And it's notable, really, if you look at its list of alumni, just how many economists are part of it. And the Morris factory contributed to the war effort as well, more broadly. It made military cars plus mines and grenades during the First World War.
Yeah, and the factory's still there, but it's not anything like its former size. So it, like many industries, declined after the Second World War. When did the decline start?
I suppose the 1970s is really when British car manufacturing generally started to decline. The Morris factory started to give way to a business park. Production did remain, but the workforce sank from 28,000 at its peak quite rapidly to about 6,000 in the late 80s. But as you said, car manufacturing does remain in Oxford today. It's still there in Cowley, where minis are built at the Oxford plant. I know a lot of people are mini enthusiasts, and you can still book a visit to the mini plant there today.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a major car manufacturing plant by British standards, owned by BMW, I believe. I think the impact of William Morris on Oxford's social history is hard to overstate, to be honest. I think particularly that part of Oxford. So that area that Cowley, the vicinity of Cowley and that whole southeastern arc, it triggered massive house building and also large-scale migration to support the factories. So a lot of workers came from South Wales, escaping unemployment there, Ireland, across the Commonwealth. And as a result, Cowley and much of that corner of Oxford, it comes to resemble more of an industrial working class community in contrast to the rest of Oxford. I think it's fair to say. And it's a stark contrast to the city centre of the north of Oxford, which is so dominated by the university buildings and a middle-class population. Southeast Oxford developed a very different urban character, large housing estates such as Blackbird Lades, but also a vibrant multicultural Cowley Road, because it's just such a diversity of people. In many ways, I feel that part of Oxford sort of feels like a different city. It's more like cities like Coventry that we've discussed before, and it's a real contrast to the image of Oxford that perhaps we all have of the academic city of spires and colleges. The political impact of this divide was profound. Cowley became a centre of strong Labour politics. There was a lot of industrial unrest. A recurring feature of life around the Morris plant perhaps contributed to its decline, particularly during its period of public ownership under British Leyland. But today, the mini plant remains a major success. It produces around 200,000 cars a year and does anchor Oxford's industrial legacy in the modern economy. Even if, as with manufacturing across UK cities, it does with far fewer workers, as you discussed. I think we've covered a lot in science and industry. How would you conclude on the importance of science and industry of Oxford?
Well, I'm not going to keep doing this throughout the episode, but I think one last time here we have to come back to that comparison with Cambridge, because that's the scene setting here. I think we gave Cambridge very high marks in this category, mainly for scientific achievement. And I started a kind of introducing this section by putting it into context and saying Cambridge had been historically the more dominant in science. But even so, we've had huge amounts to talk about. That's a relative comparison. Particularly in recent times, it's really notable how that recent change in academic focus has yielded results, saved so many lives in the field of medicine. We covered penicillin here, but also mentioned in an introductory episode the Oxford vaccine against COVID. But even beyond science, as we said, it may have been a late starter again, but Oxford really is an industrial city, the largest car manufacturing city in the country at its peak. It still has that dual character of being a university city focused on research and being a manufacturing, as you said, working class city as well. I think it's doing really, really well in both categories. So for me, it has to be a very good score. I'm going to give Oxford 8.5.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. And as we researched this episode and I read more and more about it, I sort of saw more and more science that I hadn't appreciated went on in Oxford. I'd also say that for visitors to the city, the institutions associated with these breakthroughs, they stand as living reminders of centuries of achievement. And we're about to go on to this, but I'm thinking of the Bodleian Library, the Radcliffe Observatory, the Museum of Natural History. All of these things tell this story of scientific achievement from those philosophical foundations through the painstaking experimentation to large-scale application. So for me, it's a 9.
Excellent. That is, don't want to get into relative versus expectations yet, but that is more than I would have thought that Oxford would get, even despite its reputation. That's a 17.5 out of 20.
Well, let's move on to arts and culture. So let's start with museums. Why not? Because the museums in Oxford are absolutely brilliant, because there's more museums in Oxford than we could possibly cover. Let's do the big ones. So let's start with the Ashmolean. Now, the Ashmolean Museum is one of the most visited museums in the UK. I think it's the most visited outside London. You can always debate these things, but I think it is. It sits in an impressive neoclassical style building dating from 1845. It's on Beaumont Street, and it contains an incredible range. It's an encyclopedic museum. It covers ancient Egypt, Greek and Roman antiquities, European old masters, your Raphaels, Michelangelos, Rubens. The Alfred Jewel, which is a Saxon artifact. It's got Japanese and Chinese collections and artifacts from America, including Powhatan's mantle, deerskin cloak associated with the father of Pocahontas. So absolutely extraordinary range. It's a pretty big museum as well. Tell us a bit about its history.
Yep, so the Ashmolean, my personal favourite. My children prefer natural history, you've got the dinosaurs, but this is the one I go for. It's got a really deep history. It was the very first museum in England, opened in 1683. Its exhibits were donated by Elias Ashmole, but it was originally just the University Museum, and it wasn't renamed the Ashmolean until 1899. The building has also changed. The museum was originally in what is now the History of Science Museum, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and it moved to its current premises in 1845. If you want to know what it was like in those early days, Celia Fiennes, the travel writer, was an early visitor in 1694. She called it a little building which is full of antiquities, which kind of sums it up well. She didn't go crazy about it, but she seemed to like it and enjoy her time there. She described some pictures, medals, a cane, and magnetic rocks that you could see and even handle there. So very different from the present museum. Don't try and pick things up now. The Ashmolean was a pioneer, unfortunately not an immediate trendsetter, with no more museums opened in England until the 18th century. So really did stand quite uniquely for a good time.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It's a pretty remarkable museum. But I agree, for children, the Museum of Natural History might be a bit more fun because it contains dinosaur skeletons rather, a dodo, a vast insect collection. And it's where the Huxley-Wilberforce debate that you mentioned earlier took place.
Has the last remaining soft tissue of a dodo, although unfortunately that's not on display.
Okay.
We went looking for it before we realised you had to be more important to have a look at it.
It's also, Alan, I don't mean this in a bad way, but it's one of those museums that's a bit of a museum, if that makes sense. It's like a Victorian Gothic building. And at the rear of that museum is the extraordinary Pitt Rivers Museum. Tell us a bit about the Pitt Rivers Museum.
Yeah, and the Pitt Rivers Museum opened quite a bit later. It opened in the 1880s. It's a rare example of one of Oxford's cultural institutions originating outside the university. But this wasn't the first incarnation of the Pitt Rivers display. Augustus Pitt Rivers was a soldier who just liked collecting things. He liked kind of displaying them in a developmental evolutionary order. To give an example, he might display historical guns in order to show how the technology had evolved and developed through time. Now, the government took his really quite sizable collection of objects from him in 1874 for display. Originally, they were put in what is now the Young V&A in Bethnal Green, connected with the Victoria and Albert Museum or the South Kensington Museum as it was then. Pitt Rivers, though, continued to pursue his interests following this, especially once he inherited the fortune. He was excavating archaeological sites across the country, played an important role in the professionalisation of archaeological methods, and was appointed the first National Inspector of Ancient Monuments in 1882. Now, later, when the Bethnal Green Museum, which housed his collection, had space problems in 1883, Pitt Rivers said that he would move his stuff, about 14,000 objects in total, to Oxford on the condition that the university pay for the building to house it all and an associated lecture theatre. And they agreed. So they built it next to the Ashmolean Museum and moved some of their own items in too. Now, some have suggested unkindly that the opening of the Pitt Rivers Museum kind of allowed the Ashmolean to clear its clutter out into there in 1886 and have a better think about its priorities. But, it's still a very popular museum with loads of really unique and interesting exhibits.
No, I agree. I think it's extraordinary. And I think sometimes having all those artifacts clustered together by type just gives a different perspective. And it's got artifacts from just all around the world. It's extraordinary, particularly like Northwest America and Pacific Coast artifacts. You don't get enough of those in Britain. The History of Science Museum, located on Broad Street. Another fantastic museum. This contains early instruments across medicine, astronomy and chemistry associated with some of the scientists we spoke about earlier.
As we said before, this is in the original Ashmolean Museum, built in 1683, which makes, you talk about museums of museums, this makes it the first purpose-built museum in the country and the oldest surviving one in the world. So the building itself is important even before you get to what's in there. But the most famous exhibit is probably a blackboard containing writing by Albert Einstein during a lecture in 1931. That is the one that the visitors will seek out. That is like the Mona Lisa to the Louvre. That is what people will go for.
Absolutely. I don't know if we'd understand much of what he's written there, but there we go.
I have to admit.
Good old Einstein. There is obviously other museums and still many associated with the university, but I think the one to really pick out is the Bodleian Library.
So plenty more university institutions, but the Bodleian Library is the second largest in England by number of items, with over 13 million in there. Clearly, the British Library is number one. So that shows you just how important it is that it's only number two to the British Library. The origins are the university library, founded around 1400. And one of the earliest rooms completed was Duke Humphrey's library, paid for by Henry V's brother Humphrey in 1450, very important political figure of that time. It's still there and was used in the Harry Potter films as the library at Hogwarts School. It's got this great medieval wooden feel about it. It's been used in loads of films. The Bodleian, more generally, has been used in Wonka in 2023, Mary Queen of Scots in 2018, Transformers The Last Night 2017, X-Men First Class in 2011. Really, loads and loads of different filming has gone on there.
I'm not surprised, because it's just such an impressive building, and the British Library is just a modern building, and most of the books are underground, so the sort of scale of it doesn't really come across, but it does. The Bodleian Library. I always think with Oxford, for a city of its size, these are really big museums. Mm-hmm. They're like big hitting museums. They're not like small municipal museums like the kind we discussed in our museums episode. These are like the kind of big museums you get in a capital city. And I suppose they just reflect all the scientific achievement that's gone on in the city. The museums also reflect, perhaps to some extent, this sort of the challenging expectation of museums today that have collected big collections through sort of colonialism and exploitation, and certainly in the case of the Pitt Rivers Museum, they've removed the famous shrunken heads from public display. We'll talk more about the buildings, perhaps associated with the university and these museums, in the urban landscape episode, which is the next one. Let's now turn to some of the cultural people associated with Oxford. This is an I'm afraid this is like an infinite topic.
Yes.
We could go on for days talking about this. So let's pick out some highlights for you, Daniel.
Yeah, well, as you said, there's so much we could talk about. It's highlights, a little bit subjective only here. We will talk about the Oxford Review. The Oxford Review is a student comedy group, broadly the equivalent of kind of Cambridge's Footlights to Cambridge, which has produced loads of comedians and popular cultural figures over the last few decades. Some of the famous ones, and I should emphasise some because there are so many, include two of the Monty Pythons, Alan Bennett, Rowan Atkinson, many of the other stars and contributors of Blackadder, Dudley Moore, Lee and Herring, Maggie Smith, Ken Loach. The list really is endless. Beyond modern popular culture, the university has strong links to classical music as well. Haydn wrote the Oxford Symphony, a nickname given because he performed it at a ceremony where he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the university. And the Holywell Music Room, part of Wadham College, is the oldest purpose-built concert hall in Europe, built in 1748.
Where were the concerts held before purpose-built concert hall existed?
Well, yeah, if you didn't have purpose-built places to do it, it might be private venues. A king or a lord might have his own orchestra or hire them in for a performance in one of his chambers or halls. Also churches, you might get performances of music in churches as well, but you'd expect they're big public buildings.
Are there any other major cultural figures that you'd like to pick out who studied at Oxford?
Definitely. We'll round off with a few more of the highlights. Far too many to name even a tiny sample, but from literature, some of the notable figures are the Romantic poet Percy Shelley, who was expelled after a year, Samuel Johnson, who didn't last much longer. Somewhat ironically, there's a rather nice monument to Shelley in University College, which is the one that expelled him. From the 20th century, you get the Inklings. The Inklings were a group of Oxford writers, including most famously C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, who used to meet as a group in the Eagle and Child pub and then the Lamb and Flag from 1939 to 1963. Lewis trained with Oxford Officer Training Corps in the First World War and was injured in 1918. Most famously, he wrote The Chronicles of Narnia and was the subject of the film Shadowlands. He lived in Oxford at the Kilns in Headington, which is in West Oxford, which you can visit now. And he's buried at Holy Trinity Church, also in Headington, and the C.S. Lewis Nature Reserve is out there too. Tolkien also served in the First World War. He got French fever during it. He was a professor of Anglo-Saxon, and as other historians have noted, was motivated by kind of a desire to provide a mythology for the English, despite the fact his books have become so successful in other parts of the world, particularly in America. I'll just finish off with talking a little bit about sporting figures and sporting events. We have C.B. Fry, kind of the definition of a polymath, an Oxford scholar whose sporting achievements are legendary. He held the world long jump record for 20 years, played football and cricket for England, played in an FA Cup final, and was even considered at one point for the post of King of Albania, but turned it down.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And probably the most famous sporting event to have happened in Oxford, Roger Bannister ran the first ever sub 4-minute mile at Iffley Road Track in Oxford, which is still there today. You can still pop down and have a look at it. Slightly less well known, but also quite important. The first ever 6-foot high jump was in Oxford in 1876 by Marshall Brooks.
Fantastic sporting achievements in Oxford. Now, it is a beautiful city, and just to line our listeners up for our next episode on urban landscape, there will be a lot to cover on the famous dreaming spires and the colleges of Oxford. Now, for such a university, but for such an architecturally rich city, you might imagine many depictions in art. Could you pick out some highlights from an artistic perspective?
Yes, of course. Oxford's been the subject, as you might expect, of numerous artistic depictions. So many important artistic figures have spent so many of their youthful and formative years there. You would expect that. In the visual arts, the Romantic poet Turner painted Oxford many times. A lot of these pictures are in the Ashmolean collections. His painting of Oxford High Street from 1810 is particularly famous. Aside from all from the road and all the street furniture that clutters it today, it looks actually very similar to how it is today.
It does. Same point. It's such a good street, isn't it? Mm. It's absolutely incredible. And I took a photo in the exact spot of his famous painting.
Yes, and we're definitely going to talk more about that street in a landscape. In literature, we mentioned this earlier, Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure is set mainly in Oxford. called Christminster in the book, but easily recognisable. It presents, we kind of said, this idealised but almost tragically satirical view of Oxford as a paragon of scholarship and virtue, which the tragic hero Jude might aspire to, but ultimately he never achieves, which is shown in his rejection by the university and his failure to advance his social status or achieve domestic happiness. Perhaps a more traditionally romanticised version of Oxford was depicted in Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited in 1945. Waugh was an author and an Oxford scholar who wrote this book, which was to some a sort of pseudo-biographical account of his youth in Oxford, which forms the basis of many, many people's impressions of Oxford today. Many people who've seen that, if they think of Oxford, they think of the depiction of Brideshead Revisited, particularly through the TV adaptation of 1981. And finally, in TV, quick mention for Inspector Morse, the British TV detective whose creator lived in Oxford, set the stories there, and was given the freedom of the city. And if you're a fan, you can go on a Morse tour today.
There's far more we could say, but we better wrap up. Daniel, I'm going to very quickly conclude and give a score for this category. I mean, once again, there's a lot there. The museums, I absolutely love these museums. Their history is extraordinary. They're so tied in with the city, and they're just fantastic to visit. You need plenty of time to do them all justice, and there's just such a long list of artistic and cultural connections there. So I have to give a very high score. I suppose if I was going to seek some reason not to give it a high score, I might knock a point off. There's less of the sort of the big working class music or cultural movements in the city. I don't know if that's unreasonable, unfair.
Yeah,
we compare it with Liverpool or Manchester, but it's still got to be a good score. So it's going to be an 8.
Yeah, 8. That's very good. So with Oxford covers just about everything. We could only focus on a few literary figures with deep Oxford connections, but the list of people we could have mentioned is endless. Kenneth Graham, Reverend Audrey, Dr. Seuss, Oscar Wilde, who described Oxford as the most beautiful thing in England. The English language, we didn't talk about publishing in this category, but we easily could have done. The linguistic term, the Oxford comma, a comma placed before and in the last item in the list, comes from Oxford. I have to say I stand resolutely against the Oxford comma. I
can't be bothered with it.
Nope. Not something I agree with. Back on track. The museums for a city of that size are certainly very good, and they're not. There is an Oxford museum, but these aren't local parochial museums of the type that you might get in a city of that size. They are nationally, I think, important, to an extent internationally important museum. Of course, they don't rival the major museums of London in size or scale, but nor would you expect them to. If I'm being a tad critical, couple of them, I don't include the Ashmolean in this, but a couple are maybe a little dry and dusty, a bit old for non-specialists. I mean, I know she isn't exactly the target audience. My daughter lasted about 15 seconds in the pit rivers before she got bored. But still, it's something. There's something else for her there. She can still go to the Museum of Natural History and enjoy herself looking at the dinosaurs. There's breadth there. And we have to get our expectations in check here. We're talking about not an enormous megalopolis like London, far more than any city of that size could expect to have. Sport, I do like to talk about sport where we can. Perhaps, again, to do a final comparison with Cambridge. With Cambridge, we found there were global sporting innovations like the Cambridge rules for football. What you have here are outstanding individuals and moments of greatness. Everyone knows about Roger Bannister, the 4-minute mile. The fact it happened in Oxford is amazing. In culture, the Oxford Review includes many of the most important figures in modern British satire. The list of alumni includes many brilliant figures, being a little bit unkind again for balance. Some of the alumni are a little bit average, a bit cliquey, who seem to kind of get work from their mates, I can only assume. But, there's still absolute brilliance and genius there and a huge influence I'm not going to ignore. So, in conclusion, pretty much everything covered. I can't fail but to give Oxford a high score. It's going to be a 9 from me.
Blimey, that is a high score. Well, high scores for Oxford in more categories, as we'd expect. And if anyone thinks the scoring in this podcast is slightly unfair, we do have a final category called reality versus expectations, which gives a bit of a boost to the less famous towns and cities. And we'll be coming to that in the final episode on Oxford, which is the next one, which will be urban landscape. You can find all our episodes at yeoldieguide.com and all podcast directories such as Apple, Spotify. It's on YouTube. And in all of those locations, please leave us a rating. And we'd love to receive comments. That's all from me. Goodbye.
Goodbye.